Thank you for joining us today. This is the first of two webinars we're offering about grant writing for farmers. My name is Diane Meyerfeld, and I am the Sustainable Agriculture Coordinator for the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. Today, we will hear from grants advisor Wren Almitra about the basics of designing a good grant project and where to look for funding sources. On October 2nd, we will hear about some specific grant programs that are available in Wisconsin. Some of them are national, some of them are just available in Wisconsin. And we'll focus on grant programs that are either for farmers or for people doing farming-related businesses like value-added businesses or processing. So I encourage you to join us again for that program if you can. And with that, I'd like to briefly introduce Wren. She is the grants advisor for the Michael Fields Agricultural Policy Institute, which is a nonprofit located in southeastern Wisconsin that has done a lot of work over the years on advocating for grant programs that are available to farmers, and also done a lot of outreach about the many opportunities that are available and that come and go. It is a confusing field and it's hard to keep track of. One really wonderful thing is that Wren's grant advising services are available free of charge to farmers in Wisconsin and to some surrounding states. And with that, I will turn things over to Wren. And Wren, if you want to go ahead and share your slides, that would be great. Looks and sounds good.
Okay, thank you. Hey everyone, again, I'm Wren Almitra. I'm going to give just a quick background on myself, and then I'll give you a brief overview of what we'll talk about today. So again, I serve as a grants advisor. That's one of many hats that I wear under an umbrella of grants consulting work that I do. So I do write grants, support nonprofits and businesses and grants management across the country in a number of fields, a lot of sustainable ag projects. But I also work as a grants advisor with Michael Fields, as mentioned. And my role with Michael Fields includes helping farmers and nonprofits who serve farmers, finding funding opportunities, looking at guidelines, looking at the opportunities to kind of dig into questions that folks might have about those opportunities, perhaps even reaching out to funders to get some additional questions answered. And then I can also review applications and give some, kind of broad strokes feedback on proposals. The one thing I can't do is help you write your proposal, but I can kind of assist you in basically any other aspect of the application process and talk you through it. Again, that is a free service that we provide. I'll share my contact information at the end of the presentation. You can reach out to me anytime. Just briefly, prior to working in this role, I worked for the Women Food and Agriculture Network as a programs and grants manager. And then I've also worked on small scale farms in Iowa and Arizona, and worked in an Iowa Soil and Water Conservation District as a watershed coordinator. So all of that I feel like has informed kind of the work that I do now and some of the information I'll be sharing today. So this is really going to be a very broad overview of what to know about grants, including what to think about even before applying for a grant, kind of how to take stock of what you have ready to go before applying for a grant. What to think about as you're even searching for grants, where to search for grants, and some basic kind of writing 101 tips. We only have an hour, so there's actually quite a bit more info we could be giving, of course, through a longer presentation. So again, after the presentation, I'll be available for questions. And I also encourage you to attend the next session that digs into the Wisconsin-specific funding opportunities, as those are always really, really rich and important sessions to be on. I'm not going to cover a lot of those programs today, since that'll be covered in a few weeks here. But let's go ahead and get started. As Diane mentioned, please pepper any questions you have in the chat, and I'll pause a few different times so we can cover any that you might have. And yeah, let's jump in. So this is going to probably seem like a weird way to present, but what I'm essentially doing to start us off is kind of posing a lot of questions to you. Like I said, things that you're going to need to be thinking about as you start to consider applying for grants. So kind of the first series of questions we're going to look at here are, you have a project idea. You might have a need, a problem, an opportunity in your community or on your farm that you are looking to solve, address, etc. So, the first thing is just taking stock of what exactly is that need, and what does it look like? And then also looking at, have other folks already started to address this? If so, have they kind of already resolved it? Perhaps you didn't know and you do a little research and you realize, actually, there's some other groups doing this. Perhaps groups have addressed certain parts of this problem that you could kind of tag team on or address a different part. Thinking about what would be your primary strategy to address the problem, and then what's a realistic timeline to do this. As we start to talk about, grant guidelines, that timeline piece is going to be really critical. Does your timeline line up with the funder's timeline, et cetera? So again, just kind of things to take stock of early on. And this is a list of things to literally take stock on. So really, I do recommend kind of making a list, jotting some thoughts down on paper. So what resources do you need to address the problem, and which of those do you already have, perhaps? So we're looking
Or
at,
I think I would rather have that. I don't know. I just like the so
Yakov,
this
can
is
you mute yourself? Thank you.
So these are include people power. So, what staff, partners, volunteers, or community supporters you might already have that would be a great part of your team that can contribute time. Maybe there are, again, folks that are already contributing time and you have gaps in the capacity that you need to fill through hopefully some grant funding. What funds do you already have that you could support this project with, or what do you need? And again, kind of taking stock, writing down those actual dollar amounts if you know them. What materials, supplies, equipment, again, that you need or already have. And I put time on here, as I referenced in the last slide, really thinking about how much time do you need to address this? What's your internal kind of deadline? And later we'll actually revisit this list in relation to kind of looking at grant guidelines, et cetera. So any other, things that might be unique to your project, also take stock of. This will really help you understand pretty quickly when you start looking at grant guidelines, if it's going to be a good fit or not. It will also help you, which I'm going to address here in a moment. Maybe there's an assortment of funding opportunities, not just grants, maybe loans or cost share that also will support your project or your problem, and will help you kind of decipher which might be the best fit. So some other things to think about. So one of the big things we talk about, I think, can be undervalued as an important aspect of looking at funding opportunities is how your kind of vision for your project or your problem that you're trying to solve aligns with a funder's mission and vision, et cetera. So you really want those to be aligned. I put an example here of SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education. They are very good at front and center at the top of their guidelines and on their website, listing what their mission is and some of their values. And so if you have a project that you're like, this doesn't even touch any of the funder's priorities, values, et cetera, it's probably not going to be a good fit. I don't want to say exclusively that's the case, but you just want to think about that a little bit further. You don't ever want to try to force your project into a funder's kind of grant guidelines, and you don't want to try to force, their values onto your project, et cetera. So you want to make sure that there's alignment there. Again, that's usually pretty well established on the front page of a website of a funder or guidelines. And furthering that, would your project advance, SARE in this example's mission and vision? So just think about that. Is this really going to help SARE meet its goals for their funding opportunity? And then I just mentioned this. So I do think it's important to consider, if multiple types of funding might be needed for your project. You may not totally know that until you start looking at grants and understand what they do and don't fund. For example, A lot of grants won't fund equipment over a certain amount, or may not fund salaries, or there may be some things that they don't fund that you are going to have to look elsewhere. It's very hard to find a grant to buy land, for example. That might be a better fit for a loan. So again, you may not know that till you start looking at grants, but just kind of understand that as you all know, assuming most of you are business owners, diversification is really key whenever possible. And that I would say that's true with when you're fundraising. I am primarily talking about grants today. I won't talk about loans or cost share too much, but I just wanted to put that out there as something to think about. Okay, just a few more questions for you to be thinking about. So as you actually start to, kind of dig into guidelines, which we'll cover a little bit later, you really want to understand right away, are you even an eligible entity? The example that I bring up a lot for federal programs, there's a program that called the Beginning Farmer Rancher Development Grant. And by its name, I think a lot of folks can get confused and think it is for beginning farmers to apply to. That is not a program that's available for farmers to apply as individuals. That is available for nonprofits who serve beginning farmers. And so you want to know right away, am I even able to apply for this program? Is it actually for me as an individual farmer or a nonprofit, whatever the hat is you're wearing? That should be posted front and center again on the guidelines or the website. Occasionally you have to dig a little bit more for some information, but that's one of those that they'd really try to keep at the top, so it's very clear right away. You also want to understand what a grant's average grant amount might be. So often a funder will have both a minimum and a maximum that you can apply within in terms of funding. They also may or may not share an average grant amount that they typically have given in the past or that they're expecting to give for this round. You can I think that's helpful information to have. It does not mean you necessarily have to apply for that average amount, but it's, again, just kind of helpful to know both that and the total pool of funding and how many awards that they're planning on giving. They typically can, especially for federal and state funds, they often are giving that level of information. This one's pretty huge, and unfortunately, I don't see a ton of funders listing this. I'm seeing it more and more, but I think it can be something that that you just want to be very clear on. So is the funding available upfront as a payment once you're awarded the grant? Do you get a check? Do you get a deposit, et cetera? Or do you have to incur costs first and then submit a reimbursement request? So that's huge. That can be really difficult, I know, for some folks to pay those upfront costs. I know one group I'm working with, was considering taking out a loan just to cover those upfront costs. So those are some things you want to know about. I don't want to discourage you, but that can be a barrier or an additional challenge where you have to do some creative financing to figure out how to pay if you're only going to get reimbursed later on. Last question, we'll talk a little bit more about this when we cover some basic budget stuff, but what match amount is required. So for those of you who aren't familiar, many federal programs and some state programs do require a match, which is the equivalent of you as the applicant contributing either funds or time, which is considered in-kind match, maybe supplies or materials. You're basically documenting what you can contribute to match the equivalent of the dollar amount you're asking for. So if you're asking for $50,000, there might be some grants that require a one-to-one match, which means you need to contribute an equivalent of $50,000. Match can be confusing, so I don't want to go into it a lot today. I'm not sure if that'll be addressed in the next workshop, but I'm always happy to chat about match. There are some federal programs that are starting to offer waivers, or you can apply for a waiver if you serve certain demographics, if you're a nonprofit, or if you are of a certain demographic, like an underserved farmer. So keep an eye on that with any guidelines around match. Okay, this is huge, and this is one we can't emphasize enough, is, when is the program's full timeline, including the deadline, if you are awarded funds, the grant actually starts, and the duration. So this aligns with that question I asked earlier, taking stock of your timeline for your project, you want to make sure that the actual start date and the duration of the grant might be a year that you have to spend the funds in aligns with your project needs. Federal programs especially are kind of notoriously longer before they notify you if you get an award, and then it can still be several months before the funding is available. So you really want to keep that in mind and make sure you don't apply for an opportunity expecting funds within a few months. And it may not be 6 months until 6 months or even longer, just depending on the program. The deadline is one that I'll just emphasize over and over again. If the deadline is, September 30th, we have some grants coming up September 30th. Mark on your calendar, the deadline is a week before, at least a couple days before, and really get that data in your brain. I can't emphasize enough trying to submit early, especially with federal programs. It can happen on occasion where you press the big red submit button and you get an error message or something, and it's just the worst feeling. I have been there to be getting that, a few minutes or even an hour before the deadline, and you have to figure out where kind of the error is. So whatever you can do to get your application in early, at least a couple of days, I highly recommend it. On occasion, you won't probably see it a lot, but for some funding opportunities, there might be a pre-proposal process. Again, that can extend the timeline before you even can start your project, up to 6 months, maybe longer. And so just make sure you know, again, what the timeline is. I do want to say, really emphasize that when you are applying for funding for a project, you cannot start your project before you are awarded the funds or before you're notified of when you can actually start your project. So you cannot, for pretty much any grant, there might be occasional grants out there that let you do this, but I don't know of any, that you can't get reimbursed for work you've already done. So anything you're applying for in your application, you have to wait to start until you're notified if you are getting that funding for that project and when their start date is. So that might be a little confusing. Let me know if I need to clarify that further. And then last, this one's huge, and I don't cover it a ton in this presentation today, but what are the restrictions for the use of funding? So I mentioned earlier a couple examples of things that aren't typically covered, equipment, just depending, land. So you really want to pay attention to the eligible costs. It's usually kind of labeled that way in guidelines, the eligible costs or eligible expenses, and the ineligible expenses. So look at those two lists. They typically are two different lists, really stating that clearly. If you have any questions about those as you start to look, I'm available. Many program administrators, funder administrators are available to kind of help with those questions. And I'll talk about this later. Jumping on any webinars they hold, et cetera, will be really helpful to get those kind of questions clarified on what you can and can't spend funds on. Okay, so hopefully folks aren't feeling like this, but if you are, I understand. Those are a lot of things to keep in mind. We're going to, keep going through some additional questions, but also places to find some of these answers. I actually was going to pause here, I'm realizing, to see if there are any questions that have come in.
There is one really good question in the chat from Iris Lee, and referring to one of your earlier slides of questions where you said take stock of what the needs are, what you'll need for the project and what you have in place. And the question is, what number of the 6 items listed of these, needs, is it good to have in place before seeking grants?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I'm going to address that directly here in a minute because I mentioned we're going to revisit that slide. I'm going to write that down, and I will address it if I don't in a next slide. So I'm just going to make sure I jot it down. I think the general answer will be it depends, but let me go through a few more slides, and if we haven't answered, Iris, we will get to that. Are there any others, Diane, or was that it for now?
That is the only one I'm seeing in the chat.
Okay.
So yeah, great.
Good. Okay. All right, great. Okay, so here's how you find out some of the answers, or you should actually find out a lot of the answers to these kind of grant specific questions. Again, if you can't find the answers, unfortunately, sometimes guidelines still aren't as clear as I would love them to be. There are additional ways to kind of seek those out, but everything should be listed in what is called, generally, I like to say, the guidelines. There are a lot of different names for guidelines, anything from requests for proposals, RFPs, or request for applications, RFAs, or NOFOs. So there's a lot of acronyms for, again, what I would generally refer to as the guidelines, sort of the Bible for that grant of where you'll find kind of all the answers for what you need to know before applying. I mentioned, me, I'm also someone that you can reach out to. You can also attend webinars. I believe any federal program and state program and a lot of other programs, private foundations I've worked with as well, will have a webinar, an informational webinar. Typically where I find kind of the juiciest parts of those webinars are in the Q&A parts of the session, where you're getting to hear your peers ask questions that are, I'm guessing, going to be very similar to questions you might have. And so you get a lot more depth to the information through participating and listening in on those. So I highly recommend those. I also mentioned, unless a funder explicitly says don't reach out to us, and I don't believe any federal or state agency probably is allowed to say that. There are some private funders who say we don't have capacity, don't reach out to us with questions. That won't be the case for federal and state. You can also reach out to the administrators of those programs. Sometimes, people are busy, so sometimes it might be a little bit of a delay. I always tell folks just to be persistent, or again, feel free to reach out to me. If I can help, I will, or I can help try to find the answer if I don't know. Let me see if I'm going to move something on my screen so I can see. So I did put an example in here of a SARE Farmer Rancher Grant guideline image from last year. I know they have just released those grants, and there's, I believe this has been revised a decent amount. But again, this is just a snapshot of what, page one looks like. So it tells you where to submit your proposal through the portal. It tells you when it's due. So all those key bits of information should be at the top. I didn't include images of page by page guidelines in this presentation, but further on will be information, again, about, why they're even administering this program, what's important about it. They'll often go through all the questions that you're going to need to answer in the actual application that'll be in the portal, but you can get the snapshot in the guidelines typically. So this is, like I said, a very important information. I highly recommend printing these out if that's your MO, or highlighting somehow on your computer. That's typically what I do to make sure I'm not missing anything. There's a lot of information in there, and sometimes it can be easy to miss things or overlook things. A few other ways to figure out some of the answers here. SARE's lists the projects that they have awarded in the past. They won't list the full grant proposal, but they'll give you some snapshots of what was awarded. I think that can be a good way to know, again, what are the priorities of this funder, what types of projects, and what also, as you can see here, at least, what amounts are they giving for these types of projects, et cetera. SARE actually requests that you reference these lists before you apply to make sure that you're not replicating a project that's already been done, because they want to see, kind of innovative, novel approaches to projects. So that's, like I said, for SARE, kind of a requirement, but again, it gives you a snapshot. As I mentioned, you can contact funder staff. I would also say, if you happen to know a peer that has received a grant, feel free to ask them and reach out if it feels appropriate. I worked with a group last year who they actually didn't know one of the recipients of a grant that they applied for, that they were applying for, a past recipient, but they reached out to that past recipient who had successfully received their grant and asked if they'd even be willing to share their application with them, just so they kind of had an idea of the best, kind of formatting with a successful application. And that group was willing to share their application. So that's rare. I don't hear about that happening a lot. And I, again, do it within your your comfort level, but those are some examples, at least, of ways to kind of understand further. Okay, so I brought this list up earlier, mentioned I was bringing it up again. So now we can kind of apply that list to thinking about applying for grants. So when we're thinking about, you've already kind of taken stock of what you may or may not have. And again, that might be hard to kind of know until you're applying it to a grant, like, the depth you should go into some of those details. But now you can apply it to a grant that perhaps you have found one, that you think is going to be a good fit. And now you kind of need to better understand, what you need. And there's a few key things that we want to mention here that I really haven't mentioned yet. And you're not only taking stock of what you need for the project itself, but you're taking stock of what you need to actually do the application. And if you get the grant, what you need to administer the application. So, on either end, that typically means, or typically what we're talking about is people power, capacity to apply and capacity to administer. So for a federal program, which tend to be larger applications, more funding, and a longer duration, maybe up to 3 years, it can take a substantial amount of time. It can feel like a full-time job for a while you're applying for these grants. And so you want to make sure that you actually have the time to do it. And we'll talk, a little bit here about what type of team members do you need to pull together to make that happen. The same is true for administering the project. For federal and state programs, you will need to do financial reports and narrative reports. Those might be quarterly, they might be semi-annual or annual, and then you'll typically always have a final report that's kind of a summation of the full project. That takes a lot of time, especially the bookkeeping side of it. I know if you're not super comfortable with that, that's just something to be aware of. So that's one thing that I've really been emphasizing a lot more as I become a grants advisor and working with folks, and realizing some groups just literally don't have capacity to apply for some of these, and others they do if they bring in some additional support. And so just think about that as you're starting to look at some of these programs. We already talked about match, so as I mentioned earlier, match is the contribution that you are required to make and show and demonstrate in your budget, what you are contributing in relation to the funds you're applying for. And so these are also things that could be applied to match, like I mentioned earlier: people, time, funding, materials, etc. So I'm trying to go back to Iris's question and think if I can answer it any more succinctly. I do think that it's really just going to depend on the funding opportunity. And so you may not know until you look at a grant, and their specifications around both, like I said, how long it's going to take to apply, but also, the duration of the grant, how much time you're actually contributing to the project, which will be a question you're going to be asked in the application, kind of what's your internal timeline for getting this project done, kind of teasing that out, maybe even month by month. Here's what we're going to do month 1, month 2, etc. You may not really know that until you're starting to apply. I'm trying to think if there are other ways to kind of answer that question. Yeah, I think it's just going to be very funder specific. And so I know that's not a very helpful answer right now, and I'll keep thinking about it as we're going through. And Iris, if there's other pieces of that you think I can help answer, specify further, please let me know. So I'll just say there's kind of no golden rule around it. Whatever you can take stock of in the beginning, and then if there's still some gaps and question marks, that's okay. I think once you start to apply and look how your project fits into a funder's process and specifications, I think you'll fill in some of those other gaps. And again, the gaps might be what you're asking for the funder to help you support. So I think we're getting close to another pausing questions, but we'll go through a couple more slides here. I know this is a lot of info. So starting to think about getting, organized. So you found the grant you want to apply for, or maybe even a few grants, and you're starting to kind of pull all the pieces together to start the application process. So I'll just go through a few things to think about. I've already emphasized this, and I will keep emphasizing it. I'll be a broken record on this. Starting as early as possible. So not only setting that internal deadline for yourself a few days ahead of time, but get started on day one when you decide you're going to pursue a grant. I don't know, when I was farming, way back in the day as a farmhand, we would make a crop plan that, we kind of started with a harvest date and went backwards from when we needed to seed those crops. I like to think about that similarly when you're doing your grant proposal. So what is that deadline? And, working backwards, what are the pieces I need to be working on within from that time to when I'm starting, and kind of organizing it out a little bit and calendaring it out a little bit. So again, creating kind of an internal application timeline backwards from the grant deadline. We've already covered submitting at least a few days earlier, using a checklist and an outline to keep your narrative logical. And so you can also share with your teammates, whoever's working with you on your application. So most federal programs, and it's quite possible, most like Wisconsin state programs, you'll hear more about that in the next presentation, might have a checklist ready to go for you that include everything you're going to need, attachments, etc., for the actual application. They won't necessarily go into all the questions you're answering in the narrative portion, but they'll say, make sure you have your narrative, your budget justification, and these attachments might be the checklist. If they don't have one, I highly recommend creating one and using that as you're going through the guidelines and kind of copying whatever you're needing over into that checklist. I also recommend an outline. So this is what I would typically use, or what I do use for any narrative parts of the application. So we'll go through what you're typically being requested to include in an application, including a narrative, budget, etc. Excuse me. For the narrative portion, which is going to be where kind of the juicy parts of your application are, where you're really telling your story, you're talking about why there's this problem and why there's this need and why this grant is going to help you solve that need, how you're going to do it. So it's really where you're writing out your project plan. The application guidelines should have the questions that they want you to answer specifically in that document. And that's what I would recommend copying over into a blank document and outlining there. I can't emphasize this enough. Even if the portal that you'll be ultimately applying within, and we'll talk about kind of some of the different ways you'll be applying here in a moment. Typically, you're going to be uploading everything into an online portal that you'll have an account for. Even if that portal saves your answers as you're developing them, I would still develop your application offline or in a Google Doc. It's just so easy to make edits here. Somebody else makes edits. You've already saved an answer here, and the edits didn't get copied over. It just can be just a much more streamlined process, so that once you 100% are done with your outline and your answers, you can move it over into the portal. So some of this sometimes feels perhaps a little obvious, but for me, these have been like key for me to be more organized and really not miss anything when there's so many different details to keep track of. So this fourth bullet point here, determine who you'll need on your small grant team and reach out to them as soon as possible to get them on board and get a game plan going. I mentioned small grant team only because too many can be the problem of too many cooks in the kitchen when you're writing a grant proposal. If you have 10 different people working on 10 different parts, it can be a lot. I'm not saying that isn't how you might want to approach it, but you would just need to be super organized and have a really good system for keeping track of who's doing what. More folks often also means like a lot of different ideas about how to do an application. So I would recommend a smaller grant team. Or perhaps you are the primary grant writer and you're pulling in folks for different parts of the application, et cetera. In line with getting started earlier, getting that team assembled and starting to piece out who does what as soon as possible will be critical for success. and then lining up, all the pieces that you are ultimately going to need that we've covered so far, the matching funds, your named partners equipment, supply quotes, etc. Again, some of these pieces you can be starting on day one. Some you'll need to be doing maybe perhaps a little bit further down the line. We don't have time to go into a lot of detail about when you should do which pieces. It'll really depend on your organizational kind of capacity, and also what's required in the grant. So just some things to think about. Let me see if I do see that there might be some additional questions coming in. I just wanted to share this as an example. I believe this is for the Beginning Farmer Rancher grant I mentioned earlier, which again is one that nonprofits can apply to. But this is their checklist that they had available to applicants. They already kind of had it ready to go, which was really nice. I added some additional notes for myself at the bottom, some links to get quick access to other guidelines, etc. So this is what I would expect, either a checklist that you've created for yourself or a funder to have provided. So I won't go through all these pieces, but just wanted a quick snapshot of a visual.
Wren, I don't know if there are things you want to highlight from that one, because I think it is too small for most people to really read.
Nope, I just wanted to honestly, I wasn't going to go into detail with any of it. It was, these are, like I mentioned earlier, these are the different attachments, the different parts of the application you'll need. I wasn't going to go into a lot of detail, so I apologize if it's still too small, even to kind of get that snapshot. So basically, again, this is a funder listing all the different components of what you'll need to upload into their portal. It doesn't go into the specific questions that you're going to be answering. For example, in the project narrative, can you see my cursor, or is that no? You're muted, Diane.
Sorry, I'm not see. Yes, I see
Okay.
it. Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
it comes
So,
and goes.
I'll just do an example here. Whoops, I just scratched that out. Never mind. I'm not going to annotate. Sorry about that. So project narrative is what I just covered up here. But, I mentioned the project narrative, which we'll talk about here in a moment, is where you're going to really be writing out. So you'll see here, what they're not doing is listing all the questions that you need for the project narrative. They're just saying, make sure you have your project narrative included in the application. The guidelines for what to include the project narrative are listed elsewhere. So apologies for any confusion on this. It was really just a snapshot of what a checklist could look like. Let me see how far I am away from my next questions. I am a little further away. I'm going to pause here actually, and we'll keep going after this to see what questions there are now.
The one question was someone put in a question about where can you find a list of all the funding opportunities that are available in Wisconsin. And I gave a preliminary answer in part that you will go over how to find funding sources, and also that we have a table of the main funding sources for farm and food grants that we will post on our website and send the link out for as a follow-up for all the registrants for this webinar.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I looked at that chart recently. It's really excellent. So that was really helpful for me. Were there other questions?
There's one that Iris posted directly to me that I think might be suitable to everyone, if that's all right, which is oh, okay. Is there a way, what are your thoughts on figuring out the feasibility, I think, of a feasibility study for projects? Iris, if you want to unmute yourself, I'm having trouble understanding exactly what you mean by your question. So go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it verbally.
All right, I'm sorry. I just want to know what her thoughts are on feasibility analyst or studies. Is that not the same thing as you researching out your ideas or projects? Or
When you're
would,
trying to decide what to apply to, as opposed to a feasibility analysis being what you're getting funding for. That's my confusion.
well, well, um, sometimes they want those studies in your application, depending on what you're applying for, right? So
Yes. And
I'm
some of that,
saying is it costs to do those feasibility studies. Let me start there. So isn't it the same if you've researched your idea or your project? A feas Is it the same as a feasibility study is my direct question. I want to know.
Wren, do you want to address that or do you want me to try?
Yeah, let's tag team that one. What I'll say is you're correct, Iris. So clearly you have some grant experience to know that there are some grants that will require a feasibility study. I don't see those a lot for some of the opportunities like I'm aware of for farmers. And there are some projects that actually help fund a feasibility study as well as kind of like a first phase of a project idea. So you'll just kind of want to again understand what that grant is for and what they're requiring. I would say what I'm talking about isn't quite the same, and I mean it is in terms of I think in terms of taking stock. I don't think if you were to do that process, and I'm not sure if this is what you're asking, I don't think that would fly for a funder who's asking for a very kind of formatted, formal feasibility study. But I'll pause there and see Diane if you have additional notes.
No, I think you covered all my thoughts, except I will just go back to this business that every grant is different.
Yeah.
And that's where you really just have to go back and figure out what each different grant is requiring. So, yes, in some cases, they will require something that they're calling a feasibility study, and you have to follow whatever their guidelines are. And in other cases, they just want to know that you've thought out your project well and done whatever research is needed.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is bringing up another point that Iris, I think you're also touching on is, funders when they're reviewing applications are looking to see that your project is feasible. And so they may not be requiring a formal feasibility study, but they do want to see that you've really, as Diane just said, you've really thought through your project. You've really thought through the resources that are needed to do this. You are demonstrating that you have those resources or that the grant will, supplement the resources appropriately with the ones you already have to complete this project. So that is a scope that they're looking at is how feasible is this, that they are actually going to be able to complete this, both in the timeline that they said, in the time frame and with kind of the people power and, supplies that they've requested. So I don't know if that's muddying things further for you, Iris, or not. But I mean, I think it's an important thing you're bringing up.
All right, Ren, why don't you go ahead and then, maybe if people want to return to this, we have that extra half hour built in at the end.
Yeah. And I think this is a huge one. I'll just one more note, because I think there's a lot of questions about like, well, what, again, what does that mean? Like, what will they be looking at? Are there any metrics that they're looking at specifically? So we'll talk a little bit more about like the review process, but yeah, I'd be glad to keep having this conversation. All right, I'll go through a few more and then we could even pause for one more short question Q&A. Or Diane, I guess you said just kind of finish up and then okay, cool. All right. Okay, so we kind of covered some basic, getting organized in these last couple slides. Let me see, because I don't use annotate enough, if I can get rid of this. I apologize, folks. There we go. Okay. Grant Management 101, getting registered. So I brought up that typically you will be applying through a portal. This, with government grants, you'll be applying through grants.gov, which is the bottom image here. Before that, you will need a SAMS registration and a grants.gov account. It can take some time to get registered. So if you know you're applying for a federal, if you're even anticipating the next year you're going to apply for a federal program, I would not shy away from starting that process now. For SAMs, you will have to renew every year, is my understanding, but I think once you have an account, it's not difficult to renew. I say that with a grain of salt because sometimes anything with the government can be more complicated than you want it to be, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to get registered now. It's free. That way you don't have to sweat that. There are some groups who started that process a little late and they weren't able to apply. So you just want to make sure you have your account as soon as possible. The same goes for any state portals or any other funder portal that you'll be applying to. Just get that account set up right away. Make sure you're in and started. It can just save a lot of headache and sweat. I wanted to mention just one other special note that was brought up in a conference I was at this summer doing a presentation, and somebody brought up, well, what about a farm number? People need farm numbers. And I never mentioned farm numbers in this presentation because you won't typically need a farm number for any of the grants that we're talking about. But, as we're talking about some other types of financial assistance, including loans or cost share through NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the Farm Service Agency, you will need a farm number. And as we're talking about potentially combining funds for a project, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a bad idea also to think about getting a farm number through your Farm Service Agency office. I'm not going to go into more detail right now about that, but just something to kind of keep in mind if you're not already aware of that requirement to get some federal assistance, not the grants that I'm talking about. And so just some quick writing tips. We could also do a whole presentation on, writing for grants. Again, it might go without saying, but it's important to use clear, simple language that's readable to all or most of your audiences. And I say that because, you can assume, I think it's safe to assume that there are going to be reviewers who are in the ag field to some degree. They may not be in your particular type of production. They may not be a grain farmer or a vegetable farmer. They might be, maybe they're in the animal livestock industry or something, but they're going to have some basic language. Like you probably don't need to define what organic means or what USDA means, but you also don't want to assume that they know your particular project or your location or who you are. So you kind of have to have a balance, making sure that you're being clear about what you're doing, but you don't have to go overboard defining a lot of things, as I think reviewers will know at least some of the basics about what farming is. I mentioned earlier the guidelines. I don't think what I've said explicitly is follow the guidelines explicitly. Don't stray, don't add things in that they don't say to, don't add attachments, which we'll talk about in a moment, that they don't say to, etc. So really follow exactly what they're asking you to do. The same with their narrative templates or budget templates if they have them. 100% get additional eyes on your draft for review. I mentioned that I can certainly review a draft. I would get somebody who's objective, who maybe doesn't know your project, to also review just for clarity, flow, etc. Just making sure that it feels like, they're getting what you're trying to say, which can help you build confidence that reviewers will get what you're trying to say. And then, the last note, certainly be willing to adjust your proposal. What's nice about a lot of grants, most grants, is that, as Diane said, they are all very different, 100%. There are some things that tend to be, I don't want to say universal, but very common in terms of the questions they're asking, the information they're asking for. So it's very possible that you can have some boilerplate language that you can kind of copy and paste into a new application, but make sure that you edit according to what those fresh questions are specifically asking for. So it is typical that you'll need to still do some adjustments to your narrative, even if you can recycle a lot of that language. I don't want you to copy and paste and then say you're done. Make sure you're again adjusting for each different funder. And then, last, just some additional kind of organizational and strategy notes. So if the application is asking for letters of support or letters of commitment. There is a difference we'll talk about briefly. What we would recommend, my colleague Margaret would actually recommend writing the letter for your partner that you're asking the letter from. So if you're asking for a letter from a fellow farmer or a business that might be supplying your product, we recommend providing them a template with at least some boilerplate language in there, if not actually writing it for them. I think if you don't write it for them, that's fine, but you need to really ask them to put some original organic language in there, saying what their experience is with your farm or you and why they support you. The reason this is important is because I just talked with a group the other day who had a review of their application, and one of the notes was, all the letters looked the same. I don't actually think all the letters were the same. I reviewed the letters, but they want to see unique, again, unique stories and unique support in each of those letters. They don't want them to all read the same. Make sure you understand the grant review process. So this is something that I kind of have come to late in the game, but it's so critical. So especially for federal and I believe state as well, the Wisconsin programs you might be applying to will list how they're planning to review your application, including the points or percentage they're giving to each section of your application. This is such a huge tool, in part because I have sometimes found that the language they use in that review chart or whatever that they say they're going to be looking for can sometimes be a little different than what's in the narrative, even not that they're night and day different, but maybe it's phrased a little differently. And I use that to further ensure that I'm writing to what the reviewers are wanting to see in a proposal. And then certainly just, again, giving yourself plenty of time after you've gotten some outside eyes on your application, giving yourself time to adjust as needed. Guess what? My last point here, know the grant deadline, including the time of day it's due, which is huge. Most federal programs in my brain is 11:59 Eastern time. And there was an application I was helping with last year, and that's what my assumption was. And luckily I looked, weeks in advance, and it was actually due at like noon instead. For whatever reason, that one was noon. So don't ever assume it's 5 o'clock or midnight. Make sure you see what time it's actually due. They will not accept applications after that. We're gonna just breeze through the last few slides here, and then we'll have that full half hour for questions. Okay, I'm not asking you we're not going to read this line by line, but kind of to my point earlier about, what that a lot of applications are going to have some commonalities, and one of them is going to be what they're asking for in the narrative part of your application. So again, there's going to be kind of some core parts of your application, including this narrative piece. So typically they're going to be asking for, some overview, kind of a summary, and often why they're asking for a summary is because they want something they can post to the public when they fund your project. So that's typically what a summary is. I usually don't write that till I'm done with my whole application. So I make sure I'm summarizing what I've actually written. And then they want to know your story. They want to know, what your farm's about. Some funders want more narrative storytelling. Some funders want the nuts and bolts. So you really need to kind of pay attention again. What are their specific questions asking for? Some don't want the more fluffy story, and some do. So just kind of pay attention to that. You're typically going to be asking for your goals, objectives, your approach, your method. Unfortunately, some applications ask for, goals, objectives, outcomes, outputs, metrics, they ask for all these things, and it can be confusing sometimes what the difference is between those. So again, just kind of pay attention to the guidelines and what they're saying they're looking for in each of those different sections. I mentioned, they're going to be asking for your timeline or your work plan within the grant period are you going to be doing what parts of your proposal or your project. They might be asking for personnel credentials, how you're going to do communication and outreach, especially for SARE applications. Communication outreach is huge. It's a part of pretty much any program they do. They want this to be applicable. They want it to be shareable with the community and your peers. Typically, you'll be asked for an evaluation process, how you're going to be evaluating your project, and then your budget and your budget narrative will be the next pieces, which this is not the best image. I apologize to have. I'm going to search for a better image of a grant budget proposal. But basically, what you're looking for is exactly as it sounds. You're looking for, the reviewers are looking for, what are you spending the funds? What are you going to spend the funds on? And not just what you're going to spend them on, but how. They want this, what's called a justification. They really want you to detail out the specifics, including like cost per unit or salary, et cetera. So they want that in detail. They really need to know how you're going to be spending those funds. The budget and budget narrative, I have found, are the hardest parts typically for groups or individuals for the application. And so again, if you're applying and you're struggling with this piece, I'm happy to help with this piece. But this is often, kind of what you might see where, and I don't know how easy it is to read on your end, I apologize, where you'll have kind of the request from the funder in the first column there. That's what you're asking from the federal, from the federal funds, and then you're including your match component should you be, if it's a requirement. So, typically for federal and state, they will actually kind of have this, what the order that they'd like to see. They kind of have a template for you, which is really nice that you can kind of plug into. They might actually even have a budget template form or spreadsheet that you can use. Broken record here, follow what they're kind of asking exactly, and that'll really help you make sure that you're getting everything you need covered and reviewers can see what you're asking for. One other quick note I'll make that's, I think, hugely important is make sure if you could almost line up your narrative and your budget narrative or your budget justification kind of in a line. And if you could draw lines in between them to make sure that everything you're mentioning in your narrative is included in your budget and vice versa. They don't want a surprise ask in this budget that was never mentioned in the narrative, because they'll be really confused about how does this even apply to the project? It's not clear, et cetera. So make sure that these are in alignment. Okay, we are, I realize, coming up to the hour, so I'm not going to cover this in detail, but I just wanted to, there are some typical application attachments that they'll be asking for, so make sure you pay attention to what they're asking for and don't include attachments that they haven't asked for. So just to kind of go through a couple slides on how to identify grants. So I've mainly talked about federal programs here. Historically, our grants advising work has focused on federal programs. And so these three resources are related to farm bill programs, not just grants, but also cost share, loans, et cetera. So this first green image here is actually like a decently sized booklet, very easy to read and accessible, that Michael Fields with partners published, that include all the current federal farm bill programs, including loans and cost share, et cetera. So you can download that for free on our website, which I'll share momentarily. You can ask for a paper copy to be sent to you. This middle image is where you can search for federal grants. And so it's not the prettiest, but I think it's fairly easy to search on. So there's search bars on the left-hand side. You can put in keywords or you can put in program name, et cetera, and you can get the information you need on open, closed, archived grants. And then last, this last image, the link for this image is actually on our Michael Fields website. It also is a really helpful tool for federal programs. Non-federal programs. So I didn't include a specific state grant page here, but your state Department of Agriculture is where you would go. So for Wisconsin is where you would go for those grants. Or I know that Diane mentioned a chart earlier that's available too. So I definitely recommend, looking outside of the box, not just going for federal or even state necessarily. See if there's any county municipal grants that could be applicable to your project. Perhaps even there's private foundations that want to support a cause like yours. Typically, those are only wanting to fund nonprofits. I don't want to say exclusively, but that's typically what I see with federal or sorry, private private foundations, small foundations, family foundations, etc. You can do basic internet searches. I put an example of a grant search I did. That is on occasion how I find grants. That still works. I mentioned earlier asking, peers if they've applied for grants. If so, what have they applied for? How was the process, etc. There are some free philanthropy newsletters you can apply for. Again, the chances that you're going to find a ton for you as an individual farmer or farm project might be slim. These are probably typically going to be catered to nonprofits. But if any of you are associated with nonprofits, that might be one to think about. You can add in, you can create a search. You can save search categories. So you can put in farm for your state or something, or agriculture for your state, and you can get updates on any grants that come out. Okay, sorry, I'm throwing out so much information here. Last page. So these are some grants that are coming up. I know many of these are going to be covered in the next webinar. So again, I'm not going to cover these too much. Sustainable Ag Research and Education, SARE. If you don't know about this, it's a fantastic program for farmers. I highly recommend looking into their different opportunities and finding the one that fits your project best. Farmer rancher tends to be the most common for individual farmers. So those are open now. I can help you with those applications as well. And Diane and other folks associated with SARE are incredible resources for those programs. I know many of these federal programs are going to be mentioned, so I'm not going to cover them here. And then again, some of the state programs I've listed will be covered. There's two small funding programs I wanted to bring up. The Fruit Guys Community Grant, which typically opens in January. It's typically open for a month. Those are $5,000 grants that are open for farmers and nonprofits. American Farmland Trust, maybe somebody else knows. I'm totally blanking if it's 5,000 or 10,000. But those have come out in the summer. Last summer, it was open for like 5 days, which was just painfully. You kind of had to know they were coming out. You can sign up for their newsletter to get the heads up when those are going to be published. So keep your eye on that one. It is nice, a nice one because it's more flexible in what you can use the funds for. But it's pretty competitive. It's fairly competitive. Not to discourage you, but just to know that they have a very short window, or they have in the past. So a good one to keep on the radar.
Wren,
Yeah.
Perfect. If you can also put your contact information and things in the chat, and I see people are starting to drop off, so I'm going to request, because we, for our funders at the federal level, are asked to provide demographic information from our outreach. So I'm going to post a quick poll.
So what I was saying to myself, sorry about that, is, I myself sometimes get overwhelmed even giving this presentation, because I know it's a lot to absorb in an hour. But the goal is to connect you with some new information, some new ways to think about applying, and resources to get additional help when you're applying. And so please reach out at any point if you do have questions. As Diane said, reach out to program administrators if you have questions about guidelines, et cetera. So one of the really encouraging things I'm seeing with federal programs especially, but also state programs, is the technical assistance has really gone up quite a bit in terms of, again, funders and administrators being more available to help people with questions to make it an easier application process. So I'm encouraged to see that. It's a lot of work, but it's worthwhile. It's a great opportunity to kind of help fuel the good work you're doing on your farm. So that's kind of what I'll conclude with. And thank you, Andrea, for posting the Rick Bayless. I didn't know about that Frontera one, so I'll have that on my list. Do you know much about that one, Andrew? Do you know anyone who's applied for it, or?
I'm not really sure who's applied for it. I feel like I have heard it, but this is like years ago. It is one of those, though, I think I should probably check before I open my mouth, but I feel like it's a little bit more flexible in what you can spend it on, and it looks like It's up to $15,000 and it can be for capital improvements. So it's a
Okay.
nice way to complement. I mean, I would say that the vast majority of the time you cannot buy capital asset related expenses with grants, but this is one that would let you do that. So um, I think, it could be equipment or kind of machinery related kinds of purchases.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's why I brought up the fruit guys and the
Hmm.
farmland trust as well, because it is kind of rare to find those pockets. And I feel bad every time I say it because I'll often be like, well, these are just $5,000 grants, and typically when I'm talking with a farmer, like that's a lot of money. It's like, right, right, right. I know that it's a lot of money for you. So I know you can do a lot with a little, and so those are great resources. Again, tend to be smaller, but what's nice about a smaller application is it tends to correlate with an easier application, not always. They can be in some ways. I did a presentation similar to this one recently to a beginning farmer group, and I was asked, what's the best way to practice applying for a grant if we've never applied before? And I'd never been asked that. And so I had to kind of think through how to answer. Certainly one way is to apply for some of these smaller grants that I think would help you prepare for larger grants, state or federal grants that maybe, are much heavier lift in terms of application, but also might want you to have a little more experience anyway ahead of time. But I do think if you're interested, if you've never applied before, looking at an application guideline and narrative questions, and just kind of even creating a project if you don't have one in mind, and doing it kind of internally. If you happen to have a free Saturday night and that sounds fun to you, that might be something to do. But those are just a couple ideas on kind of how to get flex those muscles and get more comfortable.
Andrew, do you want to just verbally share what you put in the chat? Because I don't know if everyone's following the
Oh,
chat.
okay. Yeah, I feel like in the past it was a little bit more broader. I
These are
was
the
looking at
Bayless
some
grants, right?
the Rig Bayless grant, the Fonterra. I'm looking down, I'm reading through it, and it says that this is impact on the Chicago food shed, and it's really kind of focused more onto the greater Chicago area. In the past, I feel like I've heard of Wisconsin farmers getting it. Now, I know that a lot of Wisconsin farmers might deliver to Chicago. There's even some CSA related activities or things that would go down there. So I don't know if that would qualify you or not, but you'd have to look into the
Okay, that's helpful.
RP a bit more.
I need to look into it further as well, clearly. One thing I didn't mention, and I should have, and Diane, perhaps you did. So my grants advising services is not limited to Wisconsin. I can work with folks in 12 upper Midwest states. I've worked with folks outside of the upper Midwest as well. So if you yourself are not in Wisconsin, or you're working in part outside of Wisconsin, that's just fine. As long as you're in an upper Midwest state, it's not a problem for me to work with you.
Well, I'm not seeing other questions come in. I just do want to go back and say, I know this was a fire hose. Wren has managed to pack in a ton of information in a very short amount of time, and you may be feeling overwhelmed. And I just want to again emphasize this is a confusing process. I understand that, but reading the specifics of each individual grant and reaching out to those contacts, going onto their websites can answer a lot of the questions that you might have. And every grant is a little bit different. There are some commonalities, but then as soon as you think you know the role, there will be a new grant program that will come out and will be slightly different. So I guess at the same time, I'm saying this is overwhelming and confusing, and don't be intimidated, because farmers have successfully applied for these grants. It can be a really great tool in the right circumstances, and there are people who can help you from the services Wren offers to the program staff to just your friends. and family members who can be actually tremendously useful providing that outside commentary. All right, well, I am not seeing more questions come in. So does anybody, Wren or Andrew, do you have any other closing comments? We're going to
Beat
stop.
the RFP 3 times.
Yes.